Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Region 1's flood risk profile presentation. We had some technical difficulties last week with the audio, so we're going to re-record this for anyone who couldn't really hear when we were on Zoom. So thank you so much for adapting to these circumstances given COVID. We know that our flood risk is not going away, so we want to make sure that we are prioritizing what we can do to mitigate flood risk in the future. So we hope this presentation can really be a resource for Region 1 as they are working through their priorities with the Regional Capacity Building Grant Program. So the main objective of this presentation is to develop a common understanding of known flood risks, vulnerabilities, and priorities in Region 1. This information, and we say that we're building on previous efforts because in 2018, the Louisiana Watershed Initiative did a listening tour, and where we really were soliciting input from professionals in Region 1, planning and policy professionals, and we were wondering, like, what are the issues here? So this presentation is meant to be building off of the information that came from those meetings. And highlighted here are some of the main points. So you can see update maps and account for rapid development in mitigation efforts. This could be due to increased development patterns causing increased flood risk because there's less area for the water to infiltrate into the ground. Establish regional collaboration, which is what we're doing with this program, and this presentation is a tool for that for these professionals working on this committee. Improve policy consistency and impact across regions, ensure adequate regional representation, prioritize projects with greatest long-term benefit. So these are some concepts that we'd love for everyone to consider in the back of your mind as you go through this presentation and listen to us. Just think about how this can be a resource for you, whether you're the public or whether you're on the regional steering committee. How could this information impact project selection during this next year for the Regional Capacity Building Grant Program, or for governance, long-term governance structures for managing flood risk from the watershed level? So and just so you know, this information is going to be recorded. It'll be on our website under Region 1, under Watershed Region 1 for you all as a reference. So the way it will work, my colleague Ben is going to go over the Region 1 flood risk assessment. And the other items on this agenda happened in person, so they won't happen right now. But on our website, there is all the information that you would need it's basically a digital package of maps, PDF of maps of Region 1. There's one large map, and I think there's about 3 or 4 subsets. And if you're interested, you can print those maps, and you can do a mapping exercise. There's instructions. There's also instructions on the website, and we'll prompt you with some questions about, do you know of any flood-prone areas in your region? You could either draw on these maps, or you could write Post-its on them, there's basically any number of ways for you to get this information to us. You could email it to us, you could scan the maps, you could drop it off at the fiscal agent for Region 1. If you'd like to submit anything, that option is available for you. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Ben, who's going to guide us through some of the information of Region 1.
Thanks so much, Brad. Hi, everyone. This is Ben Wicker. I'm the point of contact for the Office of Community Development in Region 1, and I'm going to walk you through the flood assessment tool that we have put together for your viewing. So first, about this tool, this is what we're showing you is flood risk data in Region 1. What we've done here is create an Esri story map for Region 1, which allows us and you the ability to zoom in and out of different areas on the map, consider different scales, and add data sets to continue to tell your story. All the data is GIS-based and exportable. You have been working hard to address local needs, and we're going to help y'all with tools like this to expand your flood risk considerations to the regional watershed level. So, as we look at each watershed region in Louisiana, it's clear that each faces unique risks and requires a focused effort to understand and unpack solutions. Before we understand these risks and begin to prioritize solutions, there are a couple things that we need to do. First, we need to build a common vocabulary around flood risk. Second, we need to consider various risk factors from a region's geography to the people who live there. Third, we need to rethink and advance our suite of traditional solutions and start to work with nature instead of against it. Some of you are more familiar than others with the content we're going to discuss today. I ask for your patience as we help to ensure all the steering committee members are able to actively engage in this process. Next slide, Brad. So as I mentioned, this presentation is focused entirely around Region 1. Region 1 includes 12 parishes at the northwesternmost part of the state. One thing that we do want to recognize is that all the parishes within this region have agreed to work together and address the flood risk at the watershed level. We commend your ability to come together to work towards a common solution for flood risk within Region 1. Next, we want to discuss the watershed regions that exist within Region 1. There are actually two different watersheds that reside in Region 1. They are the Red Saline watershed and the Big Cypress Sulphur. The Big Cypress Sulphur is outlined in green and the Red Saline is outlined in yellow. What we're going to talk about is hydrology. It's how water circulates throughout our entire environment and through different pathways and at different rates. If we have any questions regarding hydrology, feel free to reach out to the watershed coordinators for Region 1 or to our team within the Office of Community Development. Next, we're going to discuss different types of flood risk that exist within the state of Louisiana, and most importantly, within Region 1. One type of flood risk that we did want to briefly touch on, which does not exist in Region 1, is coastal/surge flooding. That's flooding that occurs on the coast of Louisiana. Now, the reason why we're mentioning this, and I'm sure that the folks in Region 1 are absolutely sick of hearing about the coast, is because the state has conducted extensive list of projects on the coast of Louisiana, and that's where you've seen the majority of the state's attention in previous years. Now, what's different about the watershed initiative is that it is an entire statewide initiative. So we're going to be paying as much attention to the northernmost parts of the state as we are to the southernmost parts of the state. Now, on to the types of flood risks that actually do exist in Region 1. The first is river or fluvial flooding. Fluvial flooding occurs when excessive rain falls over an extended period of time and causes the river or a body of water to exceed its capacity. That would be if, there would be to be an extreme rainfall event or snow melt in the northern parts of the country, causing, let's say, the Red River to exceed its capacity and flood a community. The next is rain-induced flash floods or pluvial floods. It is the most often the result of intense rainfall overloading an urban or suburban drainage system. That would be what we saw in the Great Floods of 2016. Those were major rain events causing the drainage systems within those urban and suburban areas or even rural areas to exceed capacity. There is another type, a subset of flooding that we did want to touch on, which does have an impact in Region 1, and that is backwater flooding. Backwater flooding is upstream flooding caused by downstream conditions such as channel restrictions and or high flow in a downstream confluence stream. So let's take a bit of a deeper dive into extreme rainfall or precipitation. The two types of flooding in region 1 result from extreme rainfall or precipitation events, causing flash flooding with little warning. Louisiana experiences some of the highest rainfall rates in the country and is often subject to high water levels in its rivers and streams. Because of its flat landscape and interconnected waterways, the impact of a rainfall event in one part of the state can be felt far beyond the boundaries of where the rain falls. Property damage can help show how interconnected these systems are. Shown here are the rainfall totals from the March of 2016 floods. The areas in shaded gray are the most extreme rainfall totals, having over 10 inches of rain in some areas. The important thing to understand here when you see this picture is that normally when you would see gray or black, you would think, oh, that's areas that haven't had extreme rainfall or extreme flooding. No, the flood levels got so high that the color wheel actually ran out of colors, and they had to shift to darker and darker shades of gray to actually show the higher and higher levels of flooding. That's to show that the majority of Region 1 had extreme levels of rainfall in 2016. Next, we look at fluvial floods. So how does rainfall impact the types of floods we experience? Fluvial floods occur when excessive rainfalls over a extended period of time cause a river to exceed its capacity, and also snow melt in the northern parts of the country. This could also be caused by spring snowmelts. In Louisiana, we monitor river heights or flood stages in the spring, watching rivers as the snowmelt in the north makes its way into the Gulf of Mexico. In recent years, record river heights have become a year-long concern as the heavy rainfall across the Midwest drained down to the Mississippi River and her tributaries, swelling her banks and stressing the entire river system. Next, we're going to discuss pluvial floods, which occur from intense rainfall that causes surface or flash or urban flooding. It is important to note that pluvial flooding is independent of an overflowing water body. So structures do not need to be located near a body of water to be at risk. In Louisiana, pluvial flooding is often a result of intense rain overloading an urban or suburban drainage system. We're showing it outside of Shreveport because we're thinking this may be a good example of pluvial flooding in 2016 in Region 1. The yellow dots indicate FEMA assistance claims. You can also see many of the areas where outside of the flood zone shown in blue. This is an idea that we're going to dive into later when we actually discuss what flood zones are and the types of flood zones that we see in Louisiana.
And
next,
Ben, I just wanted to add. Oh.
No, please, Brad.
The dots that are in red. So this is based on dollar amounts of property damage or just any disaster recovery funds, individual assistance data. So the red dots are the most severe, and the orange dots are kind of the major, and then yellow are minor.
That's right. So, I mean, you can see here that we have, yellow and red dots and orange dots throughout the region, and there's seems to be a concentration of those dots not actually in the blue flood hazard areas, which we're diving into in just a moment, but those are the areas where you're required to have flood insurance. So Brad, if you could just go on to that next slide. There we go. Thank you so much. What we're looking at here what we're going to discuss are the traditional gaps in understanding flood risk in Louisiana. FEMA is responsible for mapping the nation's hazardous flood areas. So let's talk a little here about what they do and how they traditionally think about flood risk. Keep in mind, some of this seems to be changing for the good. So we don't want to appear critical here. They are our partners in addressing mounting water risks in the state of Louisiana. To this effect, their maps provide a basis for flood insurance rates and floodplain management regulations nationwide. They also inform mapping communities of their flood vulnerability and impact development of the built environment. Most people know the special flood hazard areas as flood zones. This area includes the land covered by floodwaters of the 1% annual chance event. Keep in mind that while 1% annual, formerly known as the 100-year flood, may seem like a low probability, this means that there is a 26% chance of flooding in these areas during the lifetime of a 30-year mortgage. In these areas, the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as NFIP, floodplain management regulations, can be enforced, and traditional flood insurance must be purchased. It's worth noting that 40% of Region 1 is actually located in a flood zone. So to summarize, there are two different types of flood zones that we see in Louisiana. However, you only see one type in Region 1, and those are A zones. The types of flood zones that you do not see in Region 1 are V zones, and those are the coastal communities that reside within flood zones. Brad, can you go into the, oh no, you're good. A zones are likely to be impacted by the 1% annual chance event and experience ponding-like flood conditions. They are also they also require you to purchase flood insurance and adhere to minimum floodplain building and land use requirements. FEMA flood maps are used by government officials, developers, and planners to decide where it is safe to build. There is a chance, though, there is a challenge, though. FEMA's maps do not include future condition projections like sea level rise, changes in rainfall, and expected population growth. So what this means is that the maps aren't dynamic enough to shift when you see, increased development within the state of Louisiana and increases in population. So the maps are quickly becoming outdated. They also struggle to keep their maps up to date, as I mentioned, because of those, the increase in development and increases in populations. A recent investigation by the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General revealed that 58% of all FEMA flood maps are considered inaccurate or out of date. This makes it increasingly difficult for communities to be informed about their true flood exposure. One of the important outputs of the LWI is high-quality data and an emphasis on planning, which we see as a huge benefit to the region. If we can work toward a high level of accuracy on our data, see how our flood risk can change in the future, and plan together, we can cut our flood risk over time. Next, we're going to dive into repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, and I'm going to pass it back to Brad.
Thank you, Ben. So as this loads, we're going to add on this layer of FEMA repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, and you'll be able to see which areas that have been flooded more than twice in 10 years. This often indicates areas that have either experienced multiple storms or may indicate a local drainage issue where repetitive flooding occurs. This data, when combined with our individual assistance data from 2016, can show us emerging areas of risk, and this data is often used to prioritize mitigation funding in FEMA's program.
One thing I do want to add here, Brad, when it comes to repetitive loss, and we can just keep moving on, but I do just want to note this, is that while you don't see a lot of that, very dark color for the repetitive loss in region 1, the risk that we're going to run into is that the number of structures that are repetitive loss in region 1 is likely to increase if we don't, act quickly to mitigate flood risk within region 1. And another thing to note are those regions that have repetitive loss. We will be going over social vulnerability later, and we do want to, note those areas that have repetitive loss, a high number of repetitive loss structures, and see where they line up with that vulnerability index. Keep going, Brad.
So the areas in gray, in this light gray, have experienced about 17 to 46 properties that are repetitive loss. All right, so now we are going to do a case study with the March and August 2016 floods, which exceeded impacts associated with the 1% annual chance event across the state that Ben was describing earlier. So you'll notice a lot of data points outside of the A zone, meaning that they were not required to purchase flood insurance, and are likely, which means that they likely experience greater difficulty in recovery. So when we look at this map and we see that the yellow dots, the orange dots, or the red dots, oh, we need to zoom out. That's the problem. When we see that they're not inside the special flood hazard area, that's what we're concerned about, is what's happening to these properties that are, like, what happens. The event was so severe that, that areas outside of the special flood hazard area are getting flooded. Or it could also mean that maybe the maps, the flood insurance rate maps, are outdated, and it's not expressing the true risk. So these are just different things we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about, like, a flood risk profile. There's just different variables that could really be dictating what we're seeing on these dots. So this is a desktop review, but we would love to solicit input from anyone that may know what's going on in these areas outside of the special flood hazard area. And if you go to our website at watershed.la.gov and you go to region 3, there's a mapping exercise that you'll be able to.
It's actually region 1, Brad. Just wanted to clarify.
My apologies. You'll be able to see the area that it'll be directions that will walk you through on how to think critically about these areas in region 1 that are outside of the special flood hazard area. So to some degree, these factors contribute to the 3,739 homes impacted in region 1. Let's see, so 39% of these structures were within the special flood hazard area, and 61% of the structures were located outside of the special flood hazard area. Thus, we're not required to build to withstand the impacts of flooding or carry flood insurance. As I was just saying, so this is an inherent challenge with FEMA maps. They are intended to produce flood insurance rates, but are used to communicate risk. This risk is not reflecting future risk, so many are lulled into a feeling as though they are free of risk, or flooding will not happen to them if they are located outside of the flood zone. But as you can see here, the story is different. When a storm hits and their property is flooded, they often do not have the insurance, as we just spoke about, and it's just really, it's the expenses of recovery are much more severe. So one of the key pieces that we want to emphasize here, which is a best practice globally, is thinking about working with nature and taking stock of all the different wetlands and natural river systems that are in place in region 1 as they are, and how this could leverage the benefit. How could this natural capital, the natural environment, help to leverage the project success for your typical dredging, snagging, or your gray infrastructure? So how can can the natural environment help to make the other projects that you're more familiar with better? So it's really important that we want to start to identify ways that we can work with nature to reduce flood risk and challenges. We can begin to do this by taking stock and inventory of all the wetlands in Region 1. So the wetlands, what's so cool about the wetlands is they function as natural sponges that trap and slowly release surface water, rain, groundwater, and floodwaters. Trees, root mats, and other wetland vegetation also slow the speed of floodwaters and distribute them more slowly over the floodplain. This combined water storage and breaking action lowers flood heights. It also protects and cleanses the water quality that it will be used for drinking or for recreation. So wetlands within and downstream of urban areas are particularly valuable, counteracting the greatly increased rate and volume of surface water runoff from pavement and buildings. The holding capacity of wetlands controls floods and prevents waterlogging of crops. Preserving and restoring wetlands, together with other water retention, can often provide the level of flood control otherwise provided by expensive dredge operations and levees. Here, as a fun caveat, or just fun fact, I guess you could say, the bottomland hardwood riparian wetlands along the Mississippi River once stored at least 60 days of floodwater. Now they store only 12 days because most have been filled or drained. So it's really important to think critically here about how the wetlands can benefit us when we're thinking about regional watershed projects that are helping communities within interconnected systems of the rivers and streams and creeks. I'm going to pass it back to Ben to talk about our final piece here.
Thank you so much, Brad. Yeah, and before we sign off, there is one more piece of data that we want to highlight related to risk, and that's social vulnerability. As we consider how flooding impacts Region 1's residents, we want to spend some time looking at social vulnerability, i.e., who are the people at risk? As we've experienced in different disasters, our most vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted by flooding events, meaning that they have a harder time rebuilding and recovering when they flood. One way of maximizing vulnerability, measuring vulnerability, is through the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index, which we see on the screen right now. This index considers a variety of demographic and socioeconomic factors that affect the resilience of communities, including socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. First, what are we looking at? The geographic boundaries or colored shapes are census tracts. Generally speaking, bigger tracts are rural areas with fewer people and less density, while smaller tracts represent urban and more densely developed areas containing more people. Shades of orange and red represent higher concentrations of socially vulnerable people. That's where we need to unpack what is going on and how we can target our efforts to reduce their risk. Now, when looking at the Social Vulnerability Index, and you overlay that with the repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss map, you are going to have a deeper understanding of who's really at risk of having a harder time recovering from major flood events and who's experiencing those flood events. That's something that we actually have available for you on the Watershed website, watershed.la.gov. Go to Region 1's mapping area. You're actually able to take a slider and it essentially combines those two maps. So you can actually see those laying on top of one another. So you get a real understanding of the risk within Region 1, who's most at risk. Now,
As Ben, I was going to do a little demonstration of what you're saying.
Oh, yes, please. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to do a quick, while you're pulling that up, I'm going to just do a quick recap of everything that we've actually
Perfect.
discussed today while you're pulling that up. To recap, we've gone through several data points and concepts, and I just wanted to quickly go through those. First, we discussed the types of flood risk that we see in Region 1. The three that we discussed were backwater flooding, fluvial, and fluvial. We also discussed coastal flooding, coastal and surge flooding along the coast, and how Louisiana has dedicated a lot of time and energy to mitigating that flood risk, but the Watershed Initiative specifically is dedicated to mitigating flood risk on a statewide level. Next, we discussed special flood hazard areas. Specifically, we discussed A zones and B zones. We looked at maps showing all the A zones within Region 1. Next, we discussed the impacts of the Great Floods of 2016 in that case study. We were able to see that most of the structures that were actually impacted in those floods were not within the special flood hazard areas. Next, Brad walked us through the wetland areas in Region 1 and how they play an integral part in us mitigating flood risk within the state. And then finally, I went through the Social Vulnerability Index with everyone. Brad, do you want to walk us through that overlay that I was discussing quickly?
Yes. So for those of you that either come and play with this tool on your own, I'm going to show you an example of what you can do with the different, basically what Ben was describing was that, and what I was describing earlier is that there is a mapping exercise that we asked during the actual public meeting that was last week. We're going to give anyone that was participating or members of the public 3 weeks, so that's August 6th, by August 6th, if you have any feedback about what we're about to show you, you can submit it to your watershed coordinator or directly to us. You could email, what's our LWI email, Ben?
That is watershed@la.gov.
Beautiful. So what the mapping exercise does is it shows the whole region, Region 1, and it combines the different layers. So when we zoom in, we go into different areas of the region so you can get a better sense of where this IA data, the individual assistance data, where it's located within and without of the special flood hazard area.
And just one thing, Brad, I wanted to mention that we do have some inset maps that kind of do a deeper dive into certain areas within Region 1. I believe those are Shreveport, Minden, Colfax, and Natchitoches. And then we also have the the region-wide map as available to you as well for your input, and you can look at the overlay.
Thanks, Ben. We had a little glitch, so let's see if it'll load for us so I can show you.
Well, technical difficulties are all part of the fun.
Part of the journey.
That's right.
Here we go.
That's right.
So, here we go. So right, as Ben mentioned, Region 1 is the number 1. Then we go to Shreveport. So we zoom in on Shreveport, and you'll see this slider right here. What it does is it takes on and off of, see, there's a lot of data that's loading. So what just loaded, the blue, that's the special flood hazard area. The slider, when you take it on and off, that brings on it either takes off or brings on the social vulnerability index area. So watch, as I scroll to the left, it'll show you different areas that have that are more concentrations of socially vulnerable people, which means that these are census tracts it's in denser parts of Region 1. But you can see here how,
and again,
a lot of these dots.
One thing, Brett. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
No,
a lot of these dots are located outside of the special flood hazard area. All right, Ben, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that I wanted to remind everyone that these maps are available online, that they can, and they'll actually be able to play with this tool at their leisure, and they just need to click on the link available on the website.
So one of the main things the reason that we chose these specific areas from our desktop review is solely because look at these clusters of claims. This is around the Minden area. So we're just kind of, this poses a very interesting question of like, what's happening here? Is this, as I mentioned earlier, is the data, is it more of a flood insurance rate map? Are they outdated? Are they not reflecting the flood risk properly? Because as you see the areas in blue, that's the special flood hazard area. So why are all these points outside of that area? And I think one of the most interesting things is that the special flood hazard area really it's meant to calculate flood insurance rates, but it's not really meant to communicate risk, true risk of flood risk. So so I know FEMA they're doing a lot of work right now to revamp these maps and to update these maps, but these things take so much time, And as we all know, these flooding events have just gotten so severe with the quantity of water that falls at one given time. So here's Colfax. So it's, we all have a great opportunity with these the flood mitigation funds coming through across the state to really think about this from a planning perspective, and what can we be doing from a watershed scale in Region 1 to make some long-lasting change, to help fix these problems here. So that was Colfax. And then the last one is
Natchitoches. That's right.
Yeah.
And Natchitoches is actually where we conducted the Region 1 meeting, where we presented this, we gave this presentation live.
Yes. So you have to be patient. It's a finicky resource, but ultimately, I think it's giving us a pretty good understanding from a desktop review. However, we would love information from people that live in these areas, more so for this would be a great opportunity to contribute to the regional steering committee that's going to be making longer term decisions about projects and governance at the regional scale. So it'll help everyone if we know more details about the reality of flood risk in these areas. So thank you all so much for your attention. I hope it was helpful. And if you have any questions, Ben is your point of contact, and he'd be would be happy to help in any way we can.
Yeah, and my email is william.wicker@la.gov. If you have any questions, concerns, criticisms, feel free to shoot those my way. All right, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.